Welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe for the best Reddit creepypasta stories, perfect for bedtime chills. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a comment. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the story. Hey everyone, this is my first time posting here, but something's been eating at me and I need to get it out. I live in a small town nestled in the mountains, surrounded by dense forests and an old, abandoned gold mine. It's a quiet place where nothing much happens. Or at least, that's what we all thought until recently. It all started a few months ago. At first, it was just rumours. People would talk about hearing strange noises in the forest at night, whispers carried by the wind, eerie laughter echoing through the trees. It was easy to dismiss it as the imagination of bored townsfolk. But then, people began to disappear. The first person to go missing was old Mr. Johnson. He lived alone on the edge of town, close to the forest. One morning, his neighbour found his house empty, the front door wide open. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing out of place. It was like he had just walked out and vanished. The police searched the area, but found no clues. The forest swallowed him whole. A week later, a young woman named Emily disappeared. She had gone for a hike in the woods and never returned. Her boyfriend reported her missing when she didn't come back by nightfall. Again, the police combed the forest, but there was no trace of her. It was like she had been erased from existence. The disappearances became more frequent. People were scared to leave their houses, especially after dark. The town held meetings to discuss what was happening, but no one had any answers. Theories ranged from wild animal attacks to more sinister explanations. Some people whispered about the old gold mine, saying it was cursed, that something evil was buried deep within. I didn't believe in any of that. Not at first, but then my best friend Mike went missing. Mike and I had been friends since kindergarten. We did everything together. Fishing, hiking, you name it. He was always up for an adventure. One night, he called me, his voice trembling. He said he had heard something outside his window, something that sounded like whispering. I told him it was probably just the wind, but he insisted it was different. He sounded so scared. The next day, he was gone. I was devastated. Mike wasn't the type to just take off without telling anyone. I knew something bad had happened to him. I started having nightmares about the forest, about Mike calling out to me from the darkness. I couldn't just sit around and do nothing. I had to find him. One evening, I decided to go into the forest myself. I know it sounds stupid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Mike was still out there, waiting for me to find him. I armed myself with a flashlight and a hunting knife, more for my own peace of mind than anything else, and headed into the woods. The forest was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my feet and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. As I ventured deeper, I started to feel like I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off and kept moving. After what felt like hours, I reached the old gold mine. It was a dark, gaping hole in the ground, surrounded by rusted machinery and rotting wooden beams. The entrance was blocked off by a chain-link fence, but it looked like someone had cut a hole in it recently. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached. That's when I heard it. The whispering. It was soft at first, like the wind rustling the leaves, but it grew louder as I got closer to the mine. I couldn't make out any words, but it sounded like multiple voices, all whispering at once. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness of the mine. It was Mike, or at least it looked like him. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his eyes were wide with fear. But something was off. His movements were jerky, almost robotic, and his face was twisted into a grotesque grin. "Mike!" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is that you?" He didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there, staring at me with those wide, unblinking eyes. The whispering grew louder, and I felt a pressure in my head, like someone was squeezing my brain. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head in pain. "Help me," Mike finally said. his voice a raspy whisper. "It's inside me. Please help me." I wanted to run to him, to pull him out of that darkness, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed. The whispering was deafening now, filling my mind with incomprehensible words and terrifying images. I felt like I was losing my mind. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the whispering stopped. Mike collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing. I forced myself to my feet and ran to him, but as soon as I touched him, I knew it was too late. His body was cold and lifeless, his eyes staring blankly into the void. I stumbled back, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what to do. My best friend was dead, and something horrible was happening in that forest. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back in the safety of my own home. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispering haunted my dreams, and I kept seeing Mike's lifeless eyes staring at me. I knew I had to tell someone, but who would believe me? The police would think I was crazy, but I couldn't keep this to myself. People needed to know what was happening in that forest, what was lurking in the shadows. I had to find a way to stop it, to make sure no one else suffered the same fate as Mike. So here I am, sharing my story with you all. I don't know what's going on in those woods, but I know it's not over. Something evil is out there, and it's only getting stronger. Please, if you live near a forest, be careful. Don't go out alone. And if you hear whispering, run. After what I saw in the forest, I knew I couldn't handle this alone. I decided to reach out to someone who might believe me and have the resources to help. That's when I thought of Sarah. Sarah and I went to high school together. She moved away for college and became a journalist, specializing in weird and unexplained phenomena. If anyone could help me get to the bottom of this, it was her. I found her contact information online and sent her a detailed email, explaining everything that had happened. To my surprise, she responded almost immediately. Within a couple of days, Sarah was back in town. We met at a local diner to discuss everything. She'd brought a recording device, a notebook, and a determined look in her eyes. I recounted the events of the past few months, the disappearances, and my encounter with Mike. She listened intently, jotting down notes and asking questions. "Do you think it's connected to the old gold mine?" she asked, her eyes narrowing in thought. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "But it seems like whatever it is, it's centered around that area. The whispering, the way Mike was acting, it all started near the mine." Sarah nodded, her mind already working through possible theories. "We need to investigate the mine, but we can't do it alone. It's too dangerous." We decided to form a small team of people we trusted. Sarah reached out to a couple of her colleagues, while I contacted some friends who'd been affected by the disappearances. We met up at my house to plan our next move. The team consisted of Sarah, her colleague David, who was an expert in paranormal activities, my friend Lisa, whose brother had gone missing recently, and Mark, a local historian with extensive knowledge about the gold mine and its dark history. Together, we formed a plan to explore the mine and document anything unusual we found. The night before our planned expedition, I couldn't sleep. The events of that night in the forest kept replaying in my mind. I kept hearing the whispers, seeing Mike's lifeless eyes. I was terrified, but I knew we had to do this. We needed answers. We met early the next morning, armed with flashlights, cameras, and a couple of walkie-talkies. Mark had managed to get his hands on some old blueprints of the mine, which would help us navigate the labyrinthine tunnels. As we approached the mine entrance, a sense of foreboding settled over us. The entrance was just as I remembered it, dark and ominous. The hole in the fence was still there, a gaping invitation into the unknown. We took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air inside the mine was damp and musty, filled with the scent of earth and decay. Our flashlights cast long, eerie shadows on the walls as we moved deeper into the darkness. Mark led the way, consulting his blueprints to make sure we didn't get lost. After about half an hour of walking, we reached a large chamber. It was filled with old mining equipment, rusted and broken. In the center of the room was a large circular pit. its edges lined with crumbling stone. Sarah took out her camera and started filming, while David used his equipment to measure any paranormal activity. Suddenly, we heard it, the whispering. It was faint at first, just like before, but it grew louder and more insistent. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. The whispering seemed to come from all around us, echoing off the walls. "Do you hear that?" Lisa whispered, her face pale with fear. We nodded. The whispers were unintelligible, but they filled us with a sense of dread. David's equipment started to beep, indicating high levels of paranormal activity. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice shaking. "This place isn't safe." Just as we were about to leave, the whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. We heard a faint rustling sound, like something moving in the darkness. Our flashlights darted around the room, but we couldn't see anything. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the pit. It was Mike, or rather, something that looked like Mike. His eyes were hollow and lifeless, his body twitching unnaturally. "Help me," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "Please, help me." Before I could react, he lunged at us. We screamed and stumbled back, our flashlights flickering wildly. Sarah managed to catch it all on camera, but we were too terrified to do anything else. We ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we were back outside, gasping for breath. Once we were safe, we tried to make sense of what had happened. David reviewed the footage, and we could clearly see the figure that looked like Mike, but there was something wrong with him, something unnatural. "We need to go back," Sarah said, her voice determined. "We need to find out what's really going on down there." I agreed, though the thought of returning to that place filled me with dread. We decided to regroup and come up with a new plan. This time, we would be better prepared. We needed more equipment, more people, and a better understanding of what we were dealing with. As we left the mine behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The whispering still echoed in my mind, and I knew that whatever was in that forest, it wasn't going to let us go easily. This isn't over, not by a long shot. Things have gotten even stranger and more disturbing since our initial investigation. I've had time to process everything, and I'm ready to share what happened next. Buckle up, because this part is going to be intense. After our terrifying encounter in the mine, our team knew we needed more help. We reached out to a few more people, local volunteers and some experts in paranormal phenomena. We also decided to bring in more advanced equipment, thermal cameras, EMF detectors, and even some old-fashioned protective charms, just in case. We met at the local community centre to plan our next move. Mark, the historian, had uncovered some new information about the mine. It turns out that there were numerous unexplained deaths and disappearances during its operation in the late 1800s. Miners reported seeing shadowy figures and hearing strange voices long before the mine was abandoned. The place had a dark history that seemed to be resurfacing. "We need to go back in, but this time we need to be prepared for anything," Sarah said, spreading out a map of the mine on the table. "We're split into two teams. One will explore the deeper tunnels, while the other stays near the entrance to monitor and provide backup if needed." I ended up in the team going deeper into the mine, along with Sarah, David, and a new member named Tom, who was a retired police officer with a background in search and rescue. The second team, led by Mark, would stay near the entrance, keeping in contact with us via walkie-talkies. The night before our expedition, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mike's twisted face and heard those horrible whispers, but I couldn't back out now. Too many people had disappeared, and we needed answers. We gathered early the next morning, equipped with our new gear and a renewed sense of determination. The atmosphere was tense as we made our way to the mine. The entrance looked even more foreboding than before, a dark portal into the unknown. As we stepped inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. Our breath fogged in the chilly air, and the silence was oppressive. We moved cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The deeper we went, the stronger the sense of being watched became. After about an hour of navigating the tunnels, we reached a section that wasn't on Mark's blueprints. It appeared to be an old storage area, filled with decaying wooden crates and rusted tools. Sarah set up her camera to document everything, while David used his EMF detector, which started to spike almost immediately. "This place is a hotspot for paranormal activity," David said, his voice tinged with excitement and fear. "Whatever's here, it's powerful." Suddenly, we heard a noise. A low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. We spun around, shining our flashlights in all directions, but saw nothing. The growl came again, closer this time. Tom drew his gun, though I wasn't sure how much good it would do against whatever was down here. Then we saw it. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and flickering like a flame. It didn't walk so much as glide, moving with an unnatural grace. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its mouth twisted into a sinister smile. "Get back!" Tom shouted, aiming his gun at the figure. But before he could fire, it lunged at us, moving with inhuman speed. It knocked Tom to the ground and turned its attention to Sarah, who was frantically trying to film it. The whispers started again, louder and more insistent than before. They filled my head, drowning out my thoughts. I felt an overwhelming sense of despair and terror, like I was losing myself. But I couldn't let it win. I had to fight back. I grabbed the protective charm that Mark had given me and thrust it towards the figure. To my astonishment, it recoiled, letting out a horrible screech. The whispers faltered, and the figure seemed to waver, its form becoming less solid. "Use the charms!" I shouted to the others. Sarah and David followed my lead, holding up their charms and advancing on the figure. It shrieked again, retreating into the shadows. The whispers faded, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, his voice shaking as he got back to his feet. "Now!" We didn't need to be told twice. We retreated quickly, making our way back to the entrance where Mark and the others were waiting. When we emerged into the daylight, the relief was palpable. But we knew we couldn't stop now. We had to find a way to deal with whatever was in that mine. Back at the community centre, we reviewed the footage Sarah had captured. The shadowy figure was clearly visible, as were its glowing eyes and twisted smile. David's equipment had recorded massive spikes in electromagnetic activity, confirming that we were dealing with something powerful and dangerous. "We need to figure out what this thing is and how to stop it," Sarah said, her voice determined. "There has to be a way." We spent the next few days researching and consulting with experts. We learned that the mine might be a gateway of sorts, a place where the veil between our world and another was thin. The shadowy figure, or whatever it was, seemed to be a guardian of this gateway, feeding on the fear and despair of those who ventured too close. We also discovered that the protective charms we had used were effective because they disrupted the entity's connection to our world. If we could create a stronger disruption, we might be able to close the gateway and banish the entity for good. We began to gather materials for a ritual: candles, salt, sacred herbs, and more protective charms. It was risky, but it was our only hope. We decided to return to the mine one last time, prepared to face whatever horrors awaited us. The night before the ritual, I had the worst nightmare yet. I was back in the mine, surrounded by whispering shadows. Mike was there, but his face was twisted and demonic. He reached out to me, his fingers turning into claws. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, but despite the fear, I knew we had to do this. Too many lives had been lost, and we couldn't let this evil continue. The next morning, we gathered our supplies and made our way to the mine, hoping that this time we could finally put an end to the nightmare. Things have been moving fast, and I've barely had a moment to catch my breath. But I know you're all eager to hear what happened next, so here it is. The ritual and what we uncovered in the depths of the mine. We gathered at the entrance to the mine early in the morning. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and a thick fog hung in the air, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Our team was ready: Sarah, David, Tom, Mark, Lisa, and a few more volunteers who had heard about our mission and wanted to help. We brought all the materials we'd need for the ritual, packed in backpacks and ready to go. As we entered the mine, the sense of dread returned, heavier than before. It was like the mine itself was aware of our intentions and was trying to scare us away, but we pressed on, determined to end this once and for all. We reached the large chamber where we had encountered the shadowy figure before. This time, we set up a perimeter with salt, marking a large circle in the center of the room. We placed candles at regular intervals along the circle, lighting them to create a barrier of light. The air was thick with tension as we prepared the ritual. David, who had studied various occult practices, took the lead. He instructed us to place the sacred herbs and protective charms at specific points within the circle. We worked quickly, our hands shaking but steady. We could hear faint whispers echoing through the tunnels, but we tried to ignore them, focusing on the task at hand. "Everyone ready?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We nodded and he began to chant, reciting ancient words meant to weaken the entity's hold on our world. At first, nothing happened. The chamber remained silent except for David's chanting. But then, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The temperature dropped sharply, and the candles flickered, as if an unseen wind was trying to snuff them out. We huddled together, gripping our protective charms tightly. Suddenly, the shadowy figure appeared at the edge of the circle. It looked more menacing than ever, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It moved with an unsettling fluidity, hovering just outside the barrier we had created. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, filling our minds with terror. "Keep chanting!" Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "Don't let it distract you!" David continued, his voice strong and unwavering. The entity hissed, its form flickering like a dying flame. It lashed out, trying to break through the barrier, but the salt and candles held firm. We could feel the pressure in our heads, like our minds were being squeezed, but we didn't stop. Then, something incredible happened. The ground beneath us began to tremble, and a bright light erupted from the center of the circle. The entity let out a piercing scream, its form dissolving in the light. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. We stood there, stunned and disoriented. The light slowly faded, and the temperature returned to normal. The sense of dread lifted, replaced by an overwhelming feeling of relief. We had done it. The entity was gone. But our relief was short-lived. As we started to pack up our equipment, Mark called out from the other side of the chamber, "Hey, I found something!" We rushed over to where he was standing, near a pile of old, decaying crates. Mark had discovered a hidden passageway, partially obscured by debris. It looked ancient, even older than the rest of the mine. Curiosity piqued, we decided to investigate. The passageway led to a small, hidden chamber deep within the mine. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange symbols and markings. In the center of the room was a stone altar stained with what looked like dried blood. The atmosphere was oppressive, filled with a lingering sense of malevolence. "What is this place?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. David examined the markings on the walls, his face growing pale. "This is a place of ritual sacrifice," he said. "These symbols are meant to summon and bind powerful entities. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." We realized then that the entity we had banished wasn't the only one. The mine was a focal point for dark rituals, a gateway to something far more sinister. We had only scratched the surface of the evil that lurked here. As we stood in that chamber, the weight of our discovery settled over us. The mine had a long and dark history, and its secrets were still waiting to be uncovered. We had won a small victory, but the battle was far from over. We decided to seal the hidden chamber, using the same protective measures we had employed in the ritual. It wouldn't destroy the evil within, but it would keep it contained for now. We needed time to regroup, to plan our next steps. Leaving the mine, we felt a mix of triumph and trepidation. We had faced the darkness and come out alive, but we knew our journey was far from over. The forest and the mine still held many secrets, and we were determined to uncover them all. That night, I slept for the first time in weeks, free from nightmares. But as I drifted off, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only delayed the inevitable. The true horror of the mine was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. After our discovery in the hidden chamber, the atmosphere in town grew even more tense. Word spread about what we had found, and fear gripped the community. People were still missing, and we knew we hadn't solved the problem, only delayed it. The entity, or entities, lurking in the mine were still a threat. We regrouped at the community centre to discuss our next move. This time, we included more of the townsfolk in our plans. Everyone had a stake in this, and we needed all the help we could get. Mark had been doing more research and had uncovered a disturbing fact. The mine wasn't just a place of ritual sacrifice. It was a portal, a gateway to another realm. We need to close the portal for good, Mark said, spreading out a new set of blueprints and ancient texts he had found. If we don't, the entities will continue to use it to come into our world, David agreed, adding, we need a powerful ritual, stronger than anything we've done before. We need to seal it permanently. We spent days preparing, gathering materials and consulting with experts. Sarah reached out to some of her contacts, bringing in a few more paranormal researchers and an occult specialist named Dr. Whitmore. Dr. Whitmore was a stern, no-nonsense woman with a deep knowledge of ancient rituals and a strong will to match. The night of the final confrontation, we gathered at the mine entrance once more. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. Our group was larger this time, consisting of townsfolk, researchers, and volunteers, all determined to end this nightmare. As we descended into the mine, the oppressive atmosphere returned, heavier than ever. The deeper we went, the colder it became, and the whispers started again, faint but persistent. We reached the hidden chamber, and this time we set up a more complex ritual circle, using a combination of ancient symbols, salt, and protective herbs. Dr. Whitmore took charge, directing us to place candles, crystals, and other ritual items at specific points. She explained that we would be performing a binding and sealing ritual, powerful enough to close the portal and banish the entities for good. We need to be strong and focused, she said, her voice calm but commanding. The entities will fight back, and they will try to break our circle. We cannot let them succeed. We formed a circle around the altar, holding hands and closing our eyes as Dr. Whitmore began to chant. The air grew thick with energy, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Shadows danced at the edges of our vision, and the ground trembled beneath our feet. As the ritual progressed, the temperature dropped sharply, and a dark, swirling vortex began to form above the altar. The shadows coalesced into a towering figure, its eyes burning with malevolent light. It let out a deafening roar, shaking the very walls of the chamber. "Hold the circle!" Dr. Whitmore shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Do not break the circle, no matter what!" The entity lunged at us, but it was held back by the barrier of light and symbols we had created. It shrieked in fury, its form flickering and shifting. The whispers became a cacophony, filling our minds with fear and doubt. I felt the pressure in my head increase, like my skull was being squeezed. My vision blurred and I struggled to stay focused, but I knew we couldn't give up. We had to see this through. Suddenly, the entity's form began to waver. The vortex above the altar grew brighter, and the air crackled with energy. Dr. Whitmore's chanting grew louder, more intense. The entity let out a final, ear-piercing scream as it was pulled into the vortex, its form dissolving into shadows. The light grew blinding, and we had to shield our eyes. The ground shook violently, and it felt like the entire mine was about to collapse. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The light faded, and the chamber fell silent. We opened our eyes and looked around. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a strange sense of calm. The portal was sealed, and the entities were gone. We had done it. We carefully made our way back to the surface, emerging into the cool night air. The townsfolk who had stayed behind to support us cheered and hugged us, relief and joy evident on their faces. The nightmare was over. In the days that followed, life in our town slowly returned to normal. The disappearances stopped and people began to feel safe again. The mine was sealed off permanently and plans were made to convert the area into a memorial park, honouring those who had been lost. As for me, I finally found some peace. The nightmares stopped and I could sleep soundly for the first time in months. I knew we had faced something truly evil, but we had come out the other side stronger and more united. Thank you to everyone who followed this journey and supported us along the way. It wasn't easy, but we did it. We faced the darkness and won. Stay safe, everyone, and remember, sometimes the scariest things are the ones we cannot see. I've got a story I've been hesitant to share for a long time, but after reading some of the wild stuff on here, I think you all might appreciate it. Plus, I need to get it off my chest. This is the story of a camping trip that took a dark turn and how it brought up memories of my childhood friend, who wasn't quite human. A few years ago, my buddies and I decided to go on a camping trip deep in the woods. We wanted to get away from the city, away from our mundane lives, and just experience nature at its purest. We picked a spot near a secluded lake, miles away from any town. It was perfect, quiet, serene, and completely off the grid. The first couple of days were awesome. We hiked, fished, swam in the lake, and just enjoyed each other's company. But by the third night, we were starting to crave some excitement. We gathered around the campfire after dinner, the flames dancing and crackling, casting eerie shadows on the trees surrounding us. Someone suggested we tell scary stories, and everyone quickly agreed. One by one, my friends took turns sharing their tales. There were stories about haunted houses, ghost sightings, and urban legends. They were good, but I could tell everyone was waiting for something really terrifying. When it was my turn, I hesitated. I had a story, a true story, that I'd never shared with anyone. But the atmosphere felt right, and I figured if there was ever a time to tell it, it was now. "I've got one," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not just a story. It's something that really happened to me." Everyone leaned in closer, intrigued. The firelight reflected in their wide eyes, making the moment feel even more surreal. I took a deep breath and began. When I was a kid, maybe 7 or 8, I had a friend. His name was Eli. At least that's what I called him. Eli was different. He wasn't like other kids. In fact, he wasn't a kid at all. The looks on their faces were a mix of confusion and curiosity. I continued. We lived in a small town surrounded by dense forest. I spent most of my time exploring those woods, building forts and pretending I was on grand adventures. One day, while I was out playing, I heard a voice calling my name. It wasn't like any voice I'd heard before. It was deeper, almost animalistic, but somehow I knew it was calling to me. I followed the sound until I came to a clearing. That's where I met Eli. He looked like a boy around my age, but there was something off about him. His eyes were too dark, his skin too pale, and he had this way of moving that reminded me of a predator stalking its prey. But at the time, I didn't care. I was just excited to have a new friend. Eli and I started meeting in the woods every day. He taught me all sorts of things, how to track animals, how to move silently through the trees, and how to survive on my own. He seemed to know everything about the forest, like he was a part of it. And for a while, it was great. We had fun, and I felt like I had a secret best friend that no one else knew about. But then things started to get weird. Eli would disappear for days at a time, only to return with fresh scratches on his skin and a wild look in his eyes. He started talking about the others, creatures that lived in the forest and watched us from the shadows. He said they were jealous of our friendship and wanted to take me away. I didn't believe him at first. It sounded like one of the scary stories my dad used to tell me to keep me from wandering too far. But then, one night, I saw them. I was in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard tapping on my window. I thought it was just a tree branch, but when I looked, I saw eyes. Dark, hollow eyes staring back at me. I screamed, and my parents rushed in. They couldn't see anything, but I knew what I saw. The next day, Eli told me I needed to stay away from the windows at night, that the others could see me if I looked at them. I was terrified, but I trusted Eli. He was my friend after all. I paused to take a sip of water, my throat dry from talking. My friends were silent, their eyes fixed on me, waiting for more. That's when things really started to go downhill. Eli became more erratic, more dangerous. He'd show up with blood on his clothes and refuse to tell me where he'd been. He started to talk about rituals and sacrifices, saying the forest demanded them. I was scared, but I didn't want to lose my only friend. One night, Eli took me deep into the woods, farther than we'd ever gone before. He said he wanted to show me something. We came to a small clearing, and in the center was a makeshift altar made of stones and animal bones. Eli told me to stand on it, that it was part of a game. I was hesitant, but he insisted. As soon as I stepped on the altar, I felt a cold chill run through my body. The trees around us seemed to close in, and the shadows grew darker. Eli started to chant in a language I didn't understand, his voice deep and guttural. I tried to step off the altar, but my feet felt like they were glued to the stones. That's when I saw them again. The others. They emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They were humanoid, but their limbs were too long, their fingers too sharp. They moved in a way that made my skin crawl, like they were barely tethered to the ground. Eli stopped chanting and looked at me with a twisted smile. "They want you," he said, "but don't worry, I won't let them have you." He reached out and grabbed my hand, pulling me off the altar. The others let out a low, guttural growl and started to advance. I don't remember much after that. Everything became a blur of movement and sound. Eli dragged me through the forest, faster than I thought possible. The last thing I remember is collapsing on my front porch, my parents' worried faces looking down at me. The next day, Eli was gone. I never saw him again. My parents told me I must have been sleepwalking, that I'd had a nightmare. But I knew the truth. Eli wasn't a dream. He was real. And so were the others. For years, I tried to forget about Eli and what happened in the woods. But every now and then, I'd hear that voice calling my name, or catch a glimpse of those dark, hollow eyes watching me from the shadows. I don't know what Eli was, but he wasn't human, and I don't think he ever really left. He's still out there, somewhere, waiting. I finished my story and looked around at my friends. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. The fire crackled, and for a moment we were all silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Finally, one of my friends spoke up, his voice shaky. "Dude, that's messed up. Do you really think he's still out there?" I nodded slowly. "I do. And sometimes I think he's still watching me, waiting for the right moment to come back." We sat in silence for a while longer, the fire casting long shadows around us. Eventually, we decided to call it a night, but as I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, and that somewhere out there, Eli was waiting. The night after I shared my story, sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned in my sleeping bag, my mind replaying the memories of Eli and the others over and over again. Every rustle of the wind and crack of a branch outside my tent made me jump. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that Eli was a figment of my childhood fears, but deep down, I knew better. Morning came, and I emerged from my tent feeling exhausted. My friends were already up, brewing coffee and making breakfast. They greeted me with uneasy smiles, the tension from the night before still hanging in the air. "Rough night?" Jake asked, handing me a cup of coffee. "Yeah, you could say that," I replied, taking a sip. The hot liquid helped to clear some of the fog from my brain. We tried to go about our day as usual, but there was an undercurrent of fear that none of us could shake. The woods, once a place of adventure and fun, now felt oppressive and menacing. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister, and every sound was a potential threat. That afternoon, we decided to take a hike to clear our heads. Maybe some fresh air and exercise would help us shake off the lingering fear. We followed a trail that led us deeper into the forest, away from the lake and the campsite. The further we went, the quieter it got. The birds stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to die down, leaving an eerie silence. "Do you think it's true?" Matt asked as we walked. "Your story, I mean. Do you really think Eli is still out there?" I hesitated before answering. I don't know. Part of me hopes it was just my imagination, but another part of me is sure that he's real and that he's still out there somewhere. The others exchanged nervous glances, but didn't say anything more. We walked in silence for a while, the only sounds our footsteps crunching on the forest floor and the occasional snap of a twig. We eventually came to a clearing with a small stream running through it. We stopped to rest, refilling our water bottles and splashing our faces with the cool, clear water. As we sat on the rocks, catching our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was the same feeling I'd had as a kid when Eli and I would play in the woods. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I scanned the trees, half expecting to see those dark, hollow eyes staring back at me. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the clearing, like a branch snapping underfoot. We all jumped to our feet, our hearts racing. We looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but saw nothing. "Probably just an animal," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Yeah, probably," I muttered, though I wasn't convinced either. We decided it was time to head back to camp. The hike back felt longer than the hike out, every step filled with tension. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. We quickly started a fire and set about making dinner, trying to shake off the unease that clung to us like a second skin. As we ate, the conversation was subdued. No one wanted to talk about the strange feeling we'd all experienced in the clearing, or the fear that still gnawed at the edges of our minds. Instead, we talked about mundane things, work, sports, plans for the rest of the summer, anything to distract ourselves from the darkness closing in around us. But as the night wore on, the tension became too much to ignore. We sat around the campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows on our faces. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "Maybe we should call it a night," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Get some rest and head back to town in the morning." There were murmurs of agreement. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all scared. We quickly doused the fire and retreated to our tents, hoping that sleep would come and bring some measure of peace. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent. The sounds of the forest outside seemed louder than ever, every rustle and creak amplified by my fear. I closed my eyes and tried to think of anything but Eli and the others, but it was no use. The memories came flooding back, dragging me back to that night in the woods all those years ago. I was 8 years old, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling just like I was now. The tapping on my window had woken me up, and I was too scared to move. I knew what I would see if I looked, those dark, hollow eyes staring back at me. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it was just a nightmare. But then I heard the voice, Eli's voice, calling my name in that strange, animalistic way. "Come play with me," he whispered, his voice carrying through the night like a cold breeze. "Come play in the woods." I couldn't resist. I climbed out of bed and tiptoed to the window. Eli was there, standing just outside, his eyes glowing in the darkness. He smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp, too pointed. "Come on," he said, extending his hand. I climbed out the window and followed him into the night. The forest seemed alive, the trees whispering secrets to one another as we moved through them. Eli led me to the same clearing, the one with the altar of stones and bones. The others were there, their eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. Eli began to chant, his voice rising and falling in a strange, hypnotic rhythm. The others moved closer, their fingers reaching out, brushing against my skin. I was terrified, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped by some unseen force. Eli's chant grew louder, more urgent. The others circled around me, their eyes boring into mine. I could feel their breath on my skin, cold and clammy. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Eli's voice fell silent, and the others melted back into the shadows. Eli looked at me with those dark, predatory eyes, and for a moment I saw something human in them, something sad and lonely. "Go home," he said softly. "You're not ready yet." I stumbled back through the forest, my mind a haze of fear and confusion. When I reached my house, I climbed back through the window and crawled into bed, hoping it had all been a nightmare. But I knew it wasn't. And now, all these years later, I knew it was starting again. A rustling sound outside my tent snapped me back to the present. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound grew louder, closer. I reached for my flashlight and switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response, just the sound of footsteps crunching on the ground outside. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, the cold night air biting into my skin. I swept the flashlight around, trying to see who or what was out there. That's when I saw him. Eli, standing at the edge of the clearing, his eyes glowing in the darkness. He looked exactly the same as he had all those years ago, like he hadn't aged a day. "Eli," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond, just stood there, watching me with those dark, hollow eyes. And then he turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving me standing there trembling with fear. I crawled back into my tent, my mind racing. Eli was back, and this time I wasn't sure if I could escape him. Morning came, but it did little to dispel the fear that had settled over our camp. I barely slept after seeing Eli, my mind racing with questions and dread. When I emerged from my tent, my friends were already up, their faces pale and drawn. It was clear they hadn't slept well either. Jake was the first to speak, his voice tight with concern. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I did," I replied, my voice trembling. I told them about seeing Eli at the edge of the clearing, how he looked exactly the same as he had when I was a kid. Their faces mirrored my own fear, and for the first time, I saw doubt in their eyes. "Maybe we should pack up and leave," Matt suggested. "This place is starting to give me the creeps." We all agreed. The forest, once a place of adventure and camaraderie, now felt like a prison. We quickly packed up our gear and started the long hike back to civilization. The journey was tense and silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, glancing nervously at the shadows that seemed to follow us. As we walked, my mind kept drifting back to that night in the clearing, to the others and their dark, hollow eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching us, tracking our every move. And then there was Eli. Why had he come back? What did he want from me? We were about halfway back to the car when we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the trees. We froze, our hearts pounding in unison. The sound was unlike anything we'd heard before, a mix of animalistic rage and something more sinister. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, the growl came again, closer this time. It was followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the underbrush. We looked around frantically, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise, but saw nothing. "Run!" I shouted, and we took off, sprinting down the trail as fast as our legs could carry us. The growls and footsteps followed, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't dare look back, focusing only on putting as much distance between us and whatever was chasing us. We burst out of the forest and into the parking lot, gasping for breath. We quickly piled into the car, slamming the doors shut. Matt fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, before finally getting the engine to start. We tore out of there, the forest receding behind us. As we drove, the adrenaline slowly began to fade, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. No one spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of my apartment. Once inside, we collapsed on the couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "What the hell was that thing?" Jake finally asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, "but I think it has something to do with Eli." The others looked at me, their eyes filled with questions. I took a deep breath and began to tell them everything. About Eli, the others, and the night in the clearing. I told them how Eli had saved me from the others, how he had disappeared, and how he had come back. "I think he wants something from me," I said, "but I don't know what." The room fell silent again, each of us grappling with the enormity of the situation. Finally, Matt spoke up. "We need to find out what's going on," he said. "We can't just sit here and wait for whatever that thing was to come after us again." "But how?" Jake asked. "Where do we even start?" I thought for a moment, my mind racing. "There's someone who might be able to help," I said. "An old friend of my family. He knows a lot about folklore and the supernatural. If anyone can tell us what Eli is and what he wants, it's him." We agreed to visit the old family friend the next day. That night, we stayed together in my apartment, too scared to be alone. Every creak and groan of the building set us on edge, our nerves frayed from the encounter in the woods. As I lay in bed, I couldn't help but think about Eli. Why had he come back after all these years? What did he want from me? And what were the others? My mind churned with questions, but no answers came. I finally drifted off to sleep, my dreams filled with images of Eli and the others, their dark, hollow eyes staring back at me from the shadows. I woke up several times during the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Each time, I had to remind myself that I was safe, that Eli couldn't get to me here. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Eli had found me once before, and he could find me again. And this time, I wasn't sure if I could escape him. The next morning, we set out to visit the old family friend. His name was Samuel, and he lived in a small, secluded house on the outskirts of town. He was an eccentric man, with a vast knowledge of folklore and the supernatural. If anyone could help us, it was him. We arrived at his house and knocked on the door. After a few moments, Samuel answered, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Ah, it's been a long time," he said, ushering us inside. "What brings you here?" I quickly explained our situation, telling him about Eli, the others, and the strange events in the woods. Samuel listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression growing more serious. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "It sounds like you've encountered a skinwalker," he said finally. "They are shapeshifters, creatures of the night who can take on the form of humans or animals. They are dangerous and malevolent, and once they set their sights on you, it's very difficult to escape them." My heart sank at his words. "Is there any way to stop them?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Samuel sighed. "There are ways to protect yourself, but once a skinwalker has chosen you, it's nearly impossible to get rid of it completely. They are drawn to certain people, often those with a strong connection to the supernatural. It sounds like Eli has taken an interest in you, and that's why he's come back." "But why?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What does he want from me?" Samuel shook his head. "That's something only Eli can answer, but be careful. Skinwalkers are cunning and manipulative. They'll do whatever it takes to get what they want." We thanked Samuel for his help and left, feeling more scared than ever. As we drove back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking danger, every rustle of the wind a whisper of impending doom. When we got back, we tried to come up with a plan. We researched skinwalkers, looking for any information that might help us. But the more we learned, the more hopeless it seemed. Skinwalkers were ancient and powerful, their origins shrouded in mystery. They could take on any form, blend into any environment. How could we possibly defend ourselves against something like that? As night fell, the fear returned with a vengeance. We huddled together in the living room, trying to find comfort in each other's presence. But deep down, we knew it was only a matter of time before Eli came for me again. And this time, I wasn't sure if I could escape. The tension in my apartment was suffocating. My friends and I were on edge, every small noise making us jump. The fear that had settled over us was palpable, an invisible weight pressing down on our shoulders. We knew Eli was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, we decided to take turns keeping watch. None of us wanted to be alone, but we also knew we needed to stay vigilant. I took the first shift, sitting by the window with a baseball bat in hand, my eyes scanning the darkness outside. The hours dragged by, each minute feeling like an eternity. I tried to keep my mind occupied, but it kept drifting back to Eli and the others, to that night in the clearing and the terror I had felt. When my shift ended, I woke Jake to take over. He nodded sleepily, taking the bat from me and settling into the chair by the window. I tried to get some rest, but sleep was elusive. My mind was a whirlpool of fear and uncertainty, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Eli's dark, hollow eyes staring back at me. Eventually, I drifted off into a fitful sleep, my dreams filled with shadows and whispers. I woke up several times, my heart racing, convinced that Eli was there, watching me. Each time, I had to remind myself that I was safe, that my friends were there to protect me. But the reassurance felt hollow, a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. The next morning, we gathered in the living room, bleary-eyed and exhausted. We needed a plan, something to protect ourselves from Eli and the others. But no matter how much we brainstormed, we couldn't come up with anything concrete. We were up against something ancient and powerful, and it felt like we were fighting a losing battle. That's when Jake had an idea. "What if we go back to the clearing?" he suggested. "Maybe there's something there that can help us, something we missed." The thought of returning to the clearing sent a shiver down my spine, but I knew he was right. We couldn't just sit around waiting for Eli to come to us. We needed to take action to confront whatever was haunting us head on. We packed our bags and set out for the forest once more, the daylight providing a small measure of comfort. The hike felt longer this time, each step weighed down by dread. As we approached the clearing, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. It was as if the forest itself was warning us to turn back, but we pressed on. When we reached the clearing, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The altar of stones and bones was still there, a grim reminder of that fateful night. We stood in a circle around it, the tension thick in the air. "Now what?" Matt asked, his voice trembling. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Maybe we should try to communicate with Eli, ask him what he wants." The others looked at me like I was crazy, but they didn't have any better ideas. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Eli!" I called out, my voice shaking. "We know you're out there. Show yourself." For a moment, nothing happened. The clearing was silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Eli. He looked exactly the same as he had the night before, his eyes dark and hollow, his smile predatory. "Hello, old friend," he said, his voice a low, guttural whisper. "I've been waiting for you." "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why are you here?" Eli's smile widened. "I told you before, the others want you. They've chosen you." "Chosen me for what?" I demanded. "To join us," Eli replied. "To become one of us. The forest demands it." I took a step back, my mind racing. "I don't want to join you," I said. "I just want to be left alone." Eli's expression darkened. "It's not that simple," he said. "You were chosen for a reason. You have a connection to the supernatural, a power that the others covet. They won't stop until they have you." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always felt different, like there was something about me that set me apart from others, but I had never understood what it was. Now it seemed I had my answer. "There has to be another way," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "A way to stop them without..." without becoming one of you. Eli's eyes softened for a moment, and I saw a flicker of the friend I had known as a child. There is one way, he said, but it's dangerous. The others won't let you go easily. You'll have to confront them, face them head on. How? I asked. There's a ritual, Eli explained, a way to sever your connection to the supernatural, but it requires a sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? Jake asked, stepping forward. Eli's eyes flickered to him, then back to me. A life, he said simply. The others demand a life in exchange for yours. The air grew heavy with the weight of his words. We all looked at each other, the gravity of the situation sinking in. I felt a lump form in my throat, the reality of what I was facing hitting me like a ton of bricks. I can't do that, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't take a life. Eli stepped closer, his expression serious. You have to, he said. It's the only way to break the bond. If you don't, the others will come for you, and they won't stop until they have what they want. I looked around at my friends, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. I knew they were as scared as I was, but I also knew they wouldn't abandon me. We were in this together, for better or worse. There has to be another way, Matt said, his voice firm. We can't just kill someone. Eli shook his head. There is no other way, he said. The others are relentless. They will stop at nothing to get what they want. I felt a sense of hopelessness wash over me. I didn't want to believe Eli, but deep down, I knew he was right. The others were powerful, and they wouldn't give up easily. There has to be another way, I repeated, my voice trembling. We'll find it. We have to. Eli looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resignation. I hope you're right, he said, but be careful. The others are watching. They're always watching. With that, he turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving us standing in the clearing, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. We made our way back to the car in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The reality of our situation was sinking in, and it was clear that we were in over our heads. But we were determined to find another way, to break the bond without resorting to violence. As we drove back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking danger, every rustle of the wind a whisper of impending doom. We had entered a world of darkness and danger, and there was no turning back. That night, we gathered in my apartment, trying to come up with a plan. We researched everything we could about skinwalkers and the supernatural, looking for any hint of a way to break the bond without taking a life. But the more we read, the more hopeless it seemed. The others were ancient and powerful, and it felt like we were fighting a losing battle. As the hours ticked by, our hope began to fade. We were exhausted, our nerves frayed, and it felt like we were no closer to a solution. Finally, Jake spoke up. We can't give up, he said, his voice determined. There has to be a way. We just have to find it. I nodded, trying to summon the strength to keep going. We'll find it, I said, more to convince myself than anything else. We have to. We stayed up late into the night, poring over books and articles, searching for any glimmer of hope. But as the clock ticked past midnight, it became clear that we were out of options. Just as we were about to give up, Matt found something. Look at this, he said, his voice tinged with excitement. It's an old ritual, a way to sever the bond with the supernatural. It doesn't require a sacrifice, but it's dangerous. It involves facing the others head on, confronting them and breaking their hold over you. My heart raced as I read the description. It was risky, but it was our only hope. We quickly gathered the materials we needed and prepared for the ritual. The instructions were vague, but we followed them as best we could, hoping against hope that it would work. As we began the ritual, the air in the apartment grew heavy, the shadows deepening. I could feel the presence of the others, their dark, hollow eyes watching us. My heart pounded in my chest, fear threatening to overwhelm me, but I pushed through, focusing on the ritual, on breaking the bond that tied me to Eli and the others. The ritual was intense, the air crackling with energy. We chanted the incantations, our voices rising and falling in a strange, hypnotic rhythm. I could feel the bond weakening, the grip of the others loosening. But just as we neared the end, a dark figure appeared in the room. Eli. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and sadness, his eyes burning with intensity. "You can't break the bond," he said, his voice low and menacing. "It's too strong. The others will never let you go." I stood my ground, my voice steady. "I have to try," I said. "I won't let them take me." Eli stepped closer, his expression darkening. "You don't understand," he said. "The others are relentless. They will stop at nothing to get what they want. You're putting yourself and your friends in danger." I looked at my friends, their faces pale with fear but determined. "We're in this together," I said. "We'll find a way." Eli shook his head, his eyes filled with sadness. "I hope you're right," he said. "But be careful. The others are watching. They're always watching." With that, he disappeared, leaving us to finish the ritual. We chanted the final incantation, the air growing still and heavy. For a moment, there was silence, and then a deafening roar filled the room. The shadows writhed and twisted, the others fighting against the bond breaking. But we held our ground, our voices rising in unison, pushing back against the darkness. Finally, with a final, ear-piercing scream, the bond shattered, the shadows receded, the air growing calm once more. We collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The bond was broken. We had done it. But as I looked around the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Eli and the others were still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. We had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Breaking the bond felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but the relief was short-lived. The air still felt heavy with an ominous presence. And I couldn't shake the feeling that Eli and the others weren't done with us yet. The next few days were a blur. We stayed close to each other, too afraid to be alone. The nights were the worst. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed to whisper threats. I barely slept, my dreams haunted by Eli's dark, hollow eyes. We needed to know for sure that the bond was broken, that Eli and the others were truly gone. So we reached out to Samuel again, hoping he could offer us some guidance. He agreed to meet us at his house, saying he had something that might help. When we arrived, Samuel was waiting for us on his porch. He led us inside, his expression grave. "I've been doing some research," he said, motioning for us to sit. "There's a way to make sure the bond is truly broken, but it's dangerous." What do we need to do?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "You'll need to perform one final ritual," Samuel explained. "This one will confront the others directly. You'll have to enter their realm, face them, and force them to release their hold on you. It's the only way to ensure they're gone for good." The thought of facing the others again sent a chill down my spine, but I knew we didn't have a choice. We had to finish this, once and for all. Samuel gave us the details of the ritual. We would need to return to the clearing in the woods at midnight, the place where this all began. There, we would perform the ritual, calling out the others and forcing them to confront us. It sounded terrifying, but we were determined to see it through. That night, we gathered our supplies and set out for the clearing. The forest was eerily quiet, the shadows seeming to move and breathe around us. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a ghostly light over the trees. We reached the clearing just before midnight, the air thick with tension. We set up our supplies in a circle around the altar, following Samuel's instructions to the letter. As the clock struck midnight, we began the ritual, our voices low and steady as we chanted the incantations. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening around us. I could feel the presence of the others, their dark, hollow eyes watching from the darkness. As we chanted, a figure emerged from the shadows, Eli. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and sorrow, his eyes burning with intensity. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice a low growl. "The others won't let you go." "We have to end this," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "We can't live in fear anymore." Eli's eyes narrowed, You don't understand. The others are relentless. They will never let you go. We'll see about that, Jake said, stepping forward. We're not afraid of you. Eli's expression darkened, and the air around us seemed to crackle with energy. The others emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They moved toward us, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators closing in on their prey. We continued to chant, our voices rising in unison. The others growled and hissed, their eyes burning with rage. I could feel their power pressing down on us, but we held our ground, pushing back against the darkness. As the ritual reached its climax, the air grew thick with energy. The others circled around us, their eyes locked on mine. Eli stepped forward, his expression twisted with anger. "You think you can defeat us?" he snarled. "You're just humans. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "We're stronger than you think," I said, my voice steady. "We're not afraid of you." With a final deafening roar, the others lunged at us. But we were ready. We chanted the final incantation, our voices ringing out through the night. The air around us seemed to explode with light and energy, the others recoiling from the force of it. Eli screamed, his eyes blazing with fury. "You'll regret this," he shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. "You'll never be free of us." But we didn't stop. We pressed on, chanting the final words of the ritual. The light grew brighter, the air crackling with energy. The others shrieked and writhed, their forms dissolving into the shadows. With a final ear-piercing scream, they vanished, leaving the clearing silent and still. The air was clear. The oppressive weight lifted. We had done it. We had broken the bond. We collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. The others were gone, and Eli with them. We were finally free. As we made our way back to the car, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. We had faced our fears and won. The darkness that had haunted me for so long was finally gone. But as we drove back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The others were ancient and powerful, and I knew they wouldn't give up easily. But for now, we were safe, and that was enough. We arrived back at my apartment, the morning sun casting a warm glow over the city. We were exhausted, but there was a sense of triumph in the air. We had faced the darkness and come out on top. As we settled in, ready to catch up on some much-needed sleep, I looked out the window, the sunlight streaming in. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope. The battle was over, but the war was not, and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. I need to get this out, and maybe someone can help me make sense of it. I swear I'm not making this up. I'm not crazy, but I feel like I'm losing my grip on reality. So here it goes. Last Friday, I had to make a late-night drive back home from a work conference. It was around midnight when I left the city. The drive through the mountains is usually serene and peaceful, but that night, something felt off. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the winding roads, and a thick fog was rolling in, making visibility worse by the minute. I remember feeling a strange sense of dread as I drove deeper into the mountains. I've driven that route dozens of times, but this time, every turn seemed unfamiliar. Every tree seemed to lean in closer, and the shadows seemed to move in unnatural ways. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, my headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her long hair cascading over her face. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. The car screeched to a halt just inches from her, but when I looked up, she was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere. I got out of the car, my breath visible in the cold night air, and looked around, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the mountains and the fog swallowing everything around me. Shaken, I got back in the car and continued driving, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. Every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the trees or hear faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I turned up the radio to drown out the noise, but the static only seemed to add to the growing tension. I must have been driving for hours, though it felt like an eternity. My eyelids grew heavy, and I struggled to keep my focus on the road. The last thing I remember is crossing a narrow bridge over a river. The fog was so thick that I could barely see the edges of the bridge, and my headlights did little to penetrate the darkness. I felt a sudden, overwhelming drowsiness wash over me, and before I knew it, my eyes closed. When I blinked again, I was parked in my driveway. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. I had no recollection of the drive from the bridge to my house. I checked the clock, and it was just past 3 a.m. 3 hours had passed, but I had no memory of them. I stumbled into the house, my mind racing with confusion and fear. I checked my phone for any missed calls or messages, but there was nothing. I tried to convince myself that I must have just been really tired, that I'd somehow driven home on autopilot. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, something impossible. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the woman in white, her face hidden behind a veil of hair. I heard the whispers again, louder this time, but still indecipherable. By morning, I was a wreck. I called in sick to work and spent the day trying to piece together what had happened. That's when I noticed something strange. My car was covered in mud and scratches that hadn't been there before. The front bumper was dented, and there were deep gouges in the paint. It looked like I'd driven through hell and back, but the most disturbing part was the water. The inside of my car was damp, and there were small muddy footprints on the passenger side floor mat. I live alone. I can't explain any of this, and it's driving me insane. Did I fall asleep at the wheel and somehow make it home without crashing? Did I hallucinate the whole thing? Or is there something more sinister at play here? I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that I'm not alone. I keep hearing those whispers, even in broad daylight, and every time I see my reflection, it feels like someone else is staring back at me. I don't know what to do. I don't know who to turn to, but I needed to tell someone, anyone about this. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it. Maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. I just need to know that I'm not losing my mind. I'll post again if anything else happens. For now, I just have to keep telling myself that this is all just a bad dream. But deep down, I know it's not. Something happened to me on that drive, and I'm terrified of finding out what. After that night, my life started to spiral out of control. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The whispers became more frequent, following me everywhere I went. I tried to ignore them, but they were persistent, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see the woman in white standing behind me. I decided to take a few days off work to clear my head. Staying at home didn't help though. If anything, it made things worse. The dampness in my car had started to spread to the house. I found wet spots on the floor, walls, and even my bed. At night, I would hear dripping sounds, like water seeping through the ceiling, but I could never find the source. One morning, I woke up to find the muddy footprints again, this time leading from my front door to my bedroom. They were small, like those of a child, and they sent a chill down my spine. I checked all the doors and windows, but everything was locked. No one could have gotten in. I cleaned them up, but they reappeared the next day, and the day after that. Desperate for answers, I decided to retrace my steps from that night. I needed to know what had happened, and why I couldn't remember. I drove back to the mountains, following the same route I had taken before. The fog was still there, clinging to the trees and obscuring the road. As I crossed the narrow bridge, my heart pounded in my chest. The memory of falling asleep at the wheel and the sudden jolt of waking up in my driveway haunted me. I parked the car and got out, walking to the edge of the bridge. The river below was rushing and violent, swollen from recent rains. I stared down at the water, trying to piece together what had happened. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned, and there she was. The woman in white, standing at the edge of the bridge. Her face was still obscured by her hair, but I could feel her eyes boring into me. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot. She raised a hand and pointed at the river, then slowly began to walk towards me. My mind screamed at me to move, but my body refused to listen. As she got closer, I could see that her dress was soaked, clinging to her thin frame. Her skin was pale and almost translucent, and her hair dripped with water. She stopped just a few feet away from me and spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I finally found the strength to move, stumbling backwards towards my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and managed to get the door open. I jumped in and slammed it shut, locking it behind me. I looked up, and she was gone. The bridge was empty, save for the thick fog that seemed to close in around me. I sped home, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What had she meant? Why shouldn't I be there? The whispers in my head grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand them. When I got home, things only got worse. The wet spots and footprints had multiplied, spreading throughout the house. I could feel a damp chill in the air, and the whispers seemed to follow me from room to room. I was barely sleeping, too afraid of what I might see if I closed my eyes. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door ajar. I knew I had closed it before going to bed. I got up to close it, and that's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from downstairs. I crept down the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears, and followed the sound to the living room. There, standing in the middle of the room, was a child. A boy, no older than 6 or 7, drenched from head to toe. His clothes were tattered, and his skin was deathly pale. He was tapping his foot on the floor, creating the eerie sound that had woken me. When he saw me, he stopped and looked up, his eyes hollow and lifeless. "Mummy says you shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice echoing in the silent room. I backed away slowly, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The boy didn't move, just stood there, watching me with those empty eyes. I turned and ran back upstairs, locking myself in my bedroom. I didn't sleep at all that night, too afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. The next morning, I found the living room empty. The boy was gone, but the muddy footprints remained, leading from the front door to the spot where he had stood. I knew then that I couldn't stay in the house any longer. Whatever was happening to me, it was getting worse, and I needed to get out before it consumed me. I packed a bag and left, not knowing where I was going, just that I had to get away. But as I drove, the whispers followed me, growing louder and more urgent. I could feel eyes on me, watching my every move. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if something truly sinister was happening. All I knew was that I couldn't escape it. I kept driving, hoping to outrun whatever was haunting me. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before it caught up with me. Leaving my house was supposed to be an escape, a way to outrun the creeping dread that had taken over my life. But as I drove, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Every shadow on the road seemed to move. Every rustle in the trees sounded like footsteps. I knew I couldn't run from it, whatever it was, so I decided to face it head on. I drove back to the mountains, back to the narrow bridge where everything had gone wrong. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around my car like a living thing. As I approached the bridge, my headlights flickered and the radio cut out, plunging me into eerie silence. I parked the car and stepped out, my breath visible in the cold night air. The river below was calm, its surface smooth like glass, reflecting the moonlight. I walked to the edge of the bridge, looking down at the water. My reflection stared back at me, but something was off. The face in the water wasn't mine. It was her, the woman in white. Her eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto mine. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and when I turned, she was standing right behind me. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice a ghostly echo. "Why?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me? You're not supposed to be here," she repeated. "You're supposed to be with us." With that, the world around me seemed to shift. The fog thickened, wrapping around me like a shroud. The ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, as if I were standing on the edge of a precipice. I stumbled back, trying to find solid ground, but my foot slipped and I fell. I felt the cold water engulf me, pulling me under. I don't know how long I was underwater, but it felt like an eternity. I struggled to breathe, my lungs burning, my vision fading. I was sure I was going to die, but then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I blinked, and I was standing on the bridge again, soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably. The woman in white was gone, but the whispers remained, louder than ever. They seemed to be coming from all around me, overlapping and blending into a cacophony of voices. I staggered back to my car, desperate to escape the relentless noise. As I drove away, the whispers followed, filling the car, making it hard to think. I knew I couldn't keep running. I had to confront whatever was happening to me. I drove back to my house, my mind racing with fear and confusion. The house was dark and silent, the air heavy with the same oppressive chill that had haunted me for days. I walked inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. I made my way to the living room, where the boy had appeared. The muddy footprints were still there, leading from the front door to the center of the room. I stood there, staring at them, trying to make sense of it all. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from behind me. I turned slowly, and there he was. The boy, drenched and pale, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He stared at me, unblinking, his foot tapping the floor in that same eerie rhythm. "Mummy says you shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the whispers in my head. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" "You're not supposed to be here," he repeated, his voice blending with the whispers. "You need to come with us." "Why?" I demanded, my fear giving way to frustration. "What happened to me?" "You died," he said simply. "You died on the bridge. You're not supposed to be here." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the reality of his words sank in. I had died on the bridge. I had fallen asleep at the wheel, crashed into the river, and drowned. But somehow, I had come back. Or at least, a part of me had. "But if I'm dead, how am I here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You're not," he replied. "This is a place between worlds, a place for lost souls. You need to move on." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I was dead, trapped in some kind of purgatory, unable to move on. The whispers were the voices of other lost souls, calling out to me, trying to guide me to the other side. "What do I need to do?" I asked, desperate for answers. "You need to let go," he said. "You need to accept your death and move on. Only then can you find peace." I didn't know how to let go. I didn't know how to accept my death. But I knew I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. I had to try. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "I'll try." The boy nodded, and the whispers began to fade, the air growing still and quiet. I felt a sense of calm wash over me, a warmth spreading through my body. I closed my eyes, focusing on the feeling, letting it envelop me. When I opened my eyes, I was standing on the bridge again, the fog lifting, the moonlight shining down on me. The river below was calm, the water reflecting the stars. I felt a sense of peace, a sense of acceptance. I was ready to move on. As I turned to leave, I saw the woman in white standing at the edge of the bridge, her face no longer hidden by her hair. She smiled at me, a sad, knowing smile, and nodded. I nodded back, understanding that it was time to let go. I took a deep breath and stepped off the bridge, into the unknown, ready to find peace. As I stepped off the bridge, I expected to be engulfed by the void, to be taken to whatever afterlife awaited me, but instead I found myself back in my house, standing in the living room. The whispers were gone. replaced by an oppressive silence. The air felt heavy, thick with a sense of foreboding. I knew something was about to happen, something that would determine my fate. The room was dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the windows. I could see the muddy footprints still leading from the front door to the center of the room. But now there was something else. A shadowy figure stood in the middle of the room, shrouded in darkness. It was tall and imposing, its presence filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching my every move. As I got closer, I could see that it was the boy, but he was different. His eyes were no longer hollow and lifeless. They were filled with an intense, burning hatred. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice echoing through the room. "I know," I replied, my voice trembling. "I know I'm dead, but I don't know how to move on. Please help me." The boy's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of sadness crossing his face, but it was quickly replaced by anger. "You can't move on because you're holding on to something," he said. "Something you need to let go of." "I don't know what it is," I said, feeling a wave of despair wash over me. "I don't know what I'm holding on to." The boy stepped closer, his eyes boring into mine. "Think," he said. "Remember what happened that night." I closed my eyes, trying to piece together the fragments of my memory. I saw the road, the fog, the bridge. I remembered falling asleep at the wheel, the car plunging into the river, and then I saw it, a flash of something, a memory I had buried deep within my mind. I was driving home from the conference, but I wasn't alone. There was someone else in the car with me, a woman. She was sitting in the passenger seat, her face pale and drawn. We were arguing about something, our voices raised in anger. I couldn't remember what we were fighting about, but I knew it was important. The memory was hazy, but I could feel the emotions, the guilt and regret. "She was with me," I whispered, opening my eyes. "There was a woman with me in the car. We were arguing." The boy nodded, his expression grave. "Yes," he said. "You were arguing, and you lost control of the car. She died, and you survived. But you couldn't live with the guilt, so you buried the memory. You refused to accept what had happened." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been so consumed by guilt and regret that I had blocked out the memory of that night. I had been living in denial, unable to move on because I couldn't face the truth. "I killed her," I said, my voice breaking. "It was my fault. I killed her." The boy stepped closer, his eyes filled with compassion. "It wasn't your fault," he said. "It was an accident, but you need to forgive yourself. You need to let go of the guilt and the regret. Only then can you move on." Tears streamed down my face as I struggled to come to terms with the truth. I had been holding on to the memory, refusing to let go, and it had trapped me in this purgatory. I took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders as I finally allowed myself to forgive. "I forgive myself," I said, my voice trembling. "I forgive myself for what happened." The boy smiled, and I could see a flicker of light in his eyes. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. The room seemed to brighten, the shadows receding. "You're ready," the boy said. "You can move on now." I nodded, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. I closed my eyes, focusing on the feeling, and when I opened them again, I was standing on the bridge once more. The fog had lifted, and the moonlight illuminated the path ahead. The woman in white stood at the edge of the bridge, her face serene and peaceful. "Thank you," I said, my voice filled with gratitude. She nodded, a gentle smile on her face. "You're free now," she said. "It's time to move on." I took a deep breath and stepped forward, feeling a sense of acceptance and peace. The world around me began to fade, the bridge dissolving into a warm, welcoming light. I knew I was finally moving on, leaving the pain and regret behind. As I stepped into the light, I felt a sense of liberation, a weight lifting off my soul. I was ready to embrace whatever awaited me, to find peace and finally be free. But just as I was about to step fully into the light, I felt a hand on my shoulder, pulling me back. I turned, and there was the boy, his eyes filled with fear. "Wait," he said, his voice urgent. "There's something else. Something you need to know." Before I could ask what he meant, the world around me shifted again, the light fading, replaced by darkness. I was back in my house, the oppressive silence returning. The boy stood before me, his expression filled with dread. "There's something you need to see," he said. "Something you need to understand." I nodded, feeling a sense of foreboding. Whatever it was, I knew it was important. I followed the boy as he led me through the house, the whispers starting to return, louder and more insistent. As we reached the living room, the boy stopped and turned to face me. "You're not alone," he said, his voice trembling. "There's something else here, something dark, and it's been following you." I felt a chill run down my spine as the boy's words sank in. I wasn't just trapped in purgatory, I was being hunted by something. Something that had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Show me," I said, my voice filled with determination. "Show me what I need to do." The boy nodded, and the room around us began to shift, the shadows growing darker, the whispers louder. I knew that whatever awaited me, I had to face it. I had to confront the darkness and find a way to move on. The air in the living room grew colder, and the shadows deepened, almost swallowing the light. The boy stood beside me, his small hand clutching mine. I could feel his fear, but there was also a resolve in his eyes. He led me to the center of the room, where the muddy footprints had converged, forming a dark, wet circle on the floor. "You have to face it," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing whispers. "It's the only way." I nodded, bracing myself for whatever was coming. The temperature dropped further, and the whispers intensified, becoming a cacophony of voices, overlapping and blending into a single, overwhelming roar. I closed my eyes, focusing on the boy's hand in mine, grounding myself in the moment. When I opened my eyes, the room had changed. The walls were dark, the furniture distorted and twisted, as if viewed through a funhouse mirror. The center of the room was a swirling vortex of shadows, and within it, I could see a figure emerging. It was the woman in white, but she was different now. Her eyes were no longer sad and knowing. They were filled with a malevolent hunger. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed, her voice a distorted echo of the whispers. "You're mine." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The boy squeezed my hand, giving me strength. I knew I had to confront her, to face the darkness that had been haunting me. "No," I said, my voice firm. "I don't belong to you. I'm not afraid anymore." The woman's face twisted in anger, and she lunged at me, her hands outstretched, fingers like claws. I stood my ground, refusing to let fear control me. As she reached me, I felt a surge of energy, a warmth spreading through my body. It was the boy's hand, glowing with a soft golden light. "You can't have him," the boy said, his voice strong and clear. "He's not yours." The woman screamed, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The shadows around her writhed and twisted, but the light from the boy's hand grew brighter, pushing back the darkness. I felt a surge of strength and stepped forward, confronting the woman head-on. "I forgive myself," I said, my voice echoing in the dark room. "I accept what happened. I let go of the guilt and the regret." The woman's form began to waver, the shadows around her dissolving into mist. She let out one final, anguished scream before vanishing into the void. The room around us brightened, the oppressive silence lifting, replaced by a sense of calm and peace. The boy's hand in mine grew warmer, and I looked down to see his face, glowing with a serene light. "You did it," he said, smiling up at me. "You're free now." I felt a tear slip down my cheek as I realized the weight that had been lifted from my soul. The whispers were gone, the shadows banished. I was finally at peace. "Thank you," I said, my voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for helping me." The boy nodded, his form beginning to fade. "It's time for you to move on," he said. "Find your peace." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, and when I opened them again, I was standing on the bridge once more. The moonlight illuminated the path ahead, the fog lifted, revealing a clear, starry sky. I felt a sense of acceptance, of readiness to embrace whatever lay beyond. I took a step forward, then another, until I was walking confidently towards the light. As I moved, I felt the presence of the boy and the woman in white, now at peace, guiding me towards my final destination. The light grew brighter, enveloping me in its warmth. I felt a sense of joy, of release, as I crossed over into the unknown. The world around me faded, and I knew I was finally free. I had faced my fears, confronted the darkness, and found my way to peace. I was ready to move on, to find whatever awaited me on the other side. And as I stepped into the light, I felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that I had finally found my way home. I've always been a gamer, not like a professional esports player or anything, but I enjoy immersing myself in different worlds, losing track of time while saving kingdoms or fighting off alien invasions. So when I got an invitation to beta test a new virtual reality game, I jumped at the chance. It was from a company I'd never heard of, but the email was convincing, and I was in a bit of a gaming rut. The name of the game was Immersia, and the promise was simple: the most realistic virtual experience ever created. The invitation came with a sleek VR headset, unlike any I'd seen before. It looked almost too advanced, with sleek curves and an interface that seemed to respond to touch in a way that felt almost alive. I was eager to try it out. The instructions were straightforward. Put on the headset, lay back, and let the game take you to another world. The moment I put on the headset, everything went black. My heart raced with excitement and a little bit of fear. I'd read horror stories about VR mishaps, but they were just that, stories. I was confident nothing would go wrong. At least, I was, until the darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. It was the most realistic game environment I had ever seen. The air felt damp and cold, and I could smell the faint scent of mildew. The detail was astounding. I could even feel the rough texture of the stone floor beneath my bare feet. "Welcome to Immersia," a disembodied voice echoed through the room. "You have been chosen to test our latest and most immersive game. Your goal is simple: survive." Survive? That was a strange choice of words. Usually games had objectives like defeat the enemy or find the treasure, but survive made it sound more sinister. The door creaked open, revealing a long, dark corridor. I hesitated, but the voice urged me forward. "Time is ticking. Good luck." As I stepped into the corridor, the door slammed shut behind me. The air grew colder, and I felt a creeping sense of dread. This wasn't like any game I'd played before. It felt too real. I continued down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Every few steps, I heard faint whispers, like voices just out of reach. I came to a fork in the path. There were no signs or indicators of which way to go. I chose the left path, hoping it was the right decision. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like they were warning me. I turned a corner and found myself in a large, open room. The floor was covered in a thick, sticky substance that I couldn't identify. The smell was overpowering, a mix of rot and decay. In the center of the room was a figure, Hunched over and unmoving, I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, the figure slowly turned to face me. It was a man, or at least it had been. His skin was pale and lifeless, his eyes hollow and empty. He reached out to me, his fingers twisted and gnarled. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, help me." I wanted to help him, but I didn't know how. Before I could react, the floor beneath him gave way, and he was swallowed by darkness. His screams echoed in my ears long after he had disappeared. I was frozen in place, unable to move. This was too real. It couldn't just be a game. Suddenly the walls began to close in, the room shrinking around me. I ran back to the corridor, barely escaping the crushing walls. I was breathing heavily, my heart racing. I needed to get out of this game, but I didn't know how. The whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to be guiding me, telling me where to go. I followed them, hoping they would lead me to safety. I turned corner after corner, my surroundings growing more twisted and surreal. The walls seemed to pulsate as if they were alive. I stumbled upon another door, slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I found myself in a room filled with monitors. Each screen displayed a different scene. People walking down the street, families eating dinner, children playing in a park. It was like watching security footage from all over the world. In the center of the room was a chair with a headset similar to the one I was wearing. It was then that I realized these weren't just random scenes. They were live feeds, and the people on the screens were completely unaware they were being watched. A shiver ran down my spine. I reached for the headset in the chair, hoping it would give me some answers. As soon as I touched it, the screens flickered and went black. A message appeared. "You are not supposed to be here." The door slammed shut behind me, and the room plunged into darkness. I was trapped. Panic set in. I felt along the walls, desperately searching for a way out. The whispers were back, but now they were angry, shouting at me to leave. Just as I was about to give up hope, a hidden door slid open, revealing a narrow passageway. I squeezed through, emerging into a brightly lit room. It was a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive corridors I had been navigating. The room was empty, except for a single pedestal in the center. On it was a small, ornate box. I approached cautiously, my curiosity getting the better of me. The box was intricately carved, with strange symbols that matched those I had seen on the walls earlier. I lifted the lid, and inside was a key. The moment I touched the key, the room began to shake. The walls cracked and crumbled, and the floor started to give way. I grabbed the key and ran, barely escaping as the room collapsed behind me. I didn't know what the key was for, but I hoped it would help me get out of this nightmare. As I continued down the corridor, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. I could sense something was watching me, following my every move. I quickened my pace, the key clutched tightly in my hand. I reached another door, this one marked with the same symbols as the box. I inserted the key and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a blinding light. I stepped through, hoping it would lead me back to the real world. Instead, I found myself in another room, identical to the first one I had woken up in. The same dim lighting, the same strange symbols on the walls. I was back where I started. Despair washed over me. Was there no escape from this game? The disembodied voice returned, colder and more menacing than before. "Welcome back. You have failed. Try again." The walls began to close in once more, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this was no ordinary game. This was a nightmare, a trap designed to keep me here forever, and there was no way out. I was trapped. The walls were closing in, and I had nowhere to go. My heart pounded in my chest as the space around me shrank. Just when I thought I would be crushed, the walls stopped and slowly retreated, resetting to their original positions. I was back in the small, dimly lit room, with the strange symbols pulsing on the walls. The voice returned, even more menacing. "You cannot escape. This is your reality now." I felt a wave of despair wash over me. I had no idea how long I'd been in this nightmare, but it felt like an eternity. My mind raced with thoughts of how to get out. There had to be a way. This was just a game, right? I decided to try a different approach. Instead of blindly following the corridors, I examined the room more carefully. The symbols on the walls seemed to move, almost as if they were alive. I ran my fingers over them, feeling a slight vibration. One symbol in particular caught my eye. It was larger and more intricate than the others. As I touched the symbol, it glowed brightly, and a hidden panel slid open, revealing a passageway. I hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and stepped through. The passage led to a spiral staircase that descended into darkness. I could hear faint whispers and distant screams echoing up from below. I carefully made my way down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder, and the feeling of dread intensified. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a large, cavernous room. The walls were lined with cages, and inside each cage was a person. They were all different ages and genders, but they had one thing in common. They looked terrified. As I walked past the cages, the people inside reached out to me, begging for help. Their voices were weak and their eyes hollow. I tried to open the cages, but they were locked tight. I didn't have the key, and I had no idea how to free them. One man in particular caught my attention. He was older, with a long beard and deep-set eyes. He looked at me with a mix of hope and desperation. "You have to find the Guardian," he whispered. "It's the only way out." "Who's the Guardian?" I asked, but he shook his head. "No time to explain. Just find him. He holds the key to your escape." I nodded and continued through the room, the pleas for help echoing in my ears. I felt a growing sense of urgency. If I didn't find the Guardian soon, I might end up like the people in the cages, trapped and forgotten. The next corridor was different. The walls were lined with mirrors, and as I walked, I saw my reflection change. At first, it was just me, but as I moved forward, my reflection grew distorted. My eyes turned hollow, my skin pale and lifeless. It was like looking at a ghost. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the mirrors. I tried to block them out, but they grew louder, filling my head with voices. "You'll never escape," they chanted. "This is your fate." I stumbled through the corridor, my mind racing. I needed to find the Guardian, but I had no idea where to look. The corridor seemed endless, and the mirrors continued to distort my reflection. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw a door at the end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light shone through the crack. I pushed the door open and found myself in a small circular room. In the center of the room was a pedestal with a book on it. The book was old and worn, its cover adorned with the same strange symbols that were on the walls. I opened it, hoping to find some answers. The pages were filled with intricate drawings and cryptic text. As I flipped through, I found a section about the Guardian. According to the book, the Guardian was a powerful entity that controlled the game. He could manipulate the environment and the minds of the players. The only way to escape was to find and defeat him. The book mentioned a location called the Labyrinth, where the Guardian resided. It was a maze of twisting corridors and hidden traps, designed to keep intruders out. But it also mentioned a secret passage that could lead me directly to the Guardian's lair. Armed with this new information, I set out to find the Labyrinth. The journey was arduous, and I faced numerous challenges along the way. The corridors seemed to twist and turn, leading me in circles. I encountered more people trapped in cages, their cries for help growing more desperate. At one point, I found myself in a room filled with mannequins. They were eerily lifelike, their glassy eyes staring at me as I passed. I tried to ignore them, but as I reached the other side of the room, they began to move. Their heads turned to follow me, their limbs twitching. I felt a chill run down my spine and hurried out of the room. After what felt like hours, I finally found the entrance to the labyrinth. The walls were covered in vines and moss, and the air was thick with humidity. The whispers were louder here, almost deafening. I steeled myself and stepped inside. The labyrinth was even more disorienting than I had anticipated. The corridors twisted and turned, doubling back on themselves. There were dead ends and hidden traps, designed to confuse and ensnare anyone who dared enter. I carefully navigated my way through, using the book as a guide. Eventually, I found the secret passage mentioned in the book. It was hidden behind a false wall, and I had to solve a series of puzzles to unlock it. The puzzles were intricate and required a combination of logic and intuition. It was as if the game was testing my resolve. Finally, the passage opened, revealing a narrow tunnel. I crawled through, emerging into a large open chamber. In the center of the chamber stood a figure, cloaked in darkness. It was the Guardian. He turned to face me, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You've done well to make it this far," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "But your journey ends here." I felt a surge of fear and determination. This was my chance to escape, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. The Guardian was powerful, and I had no idea how to defeat him, but I had come too far to give up now. The Guardian stood before me, shrouded in darkness, his glowing eyes piercing through the gloom. The chamber was vast, with high ceilings that disappeared into the shadows above. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on me. This was the final confrontation, and my only chance to escape this nightmarish game. "You've proven resourceful," the Guardian said, his voice echoing around the chamber. "But this is where your journey ends." I clenched my fists, feeling a mix of fear and determination. I had come too far to back down now. I had to find a way to defeat him and escape this twisted reality. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why trap people in this game?" The Guardian tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question. "Because it is my purpose," he replied. "I am the keeper of this realm, and you are here to test the boundaries of your reality. It is a game, after all." His words sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just a game. It was a twisted experiment, and I was the unwitting participant. But I couldn't let his words intimidate me. I had to stay focused. "Let's get this over with," I said, my voice stronger now. "What do I need to do to defeat you?" The Guardian's eyes seemed to glow brighter, and a sinister smile crossed his face. "Very well," he said. "To defeat me, you must complete 3 challenges. Succeed, and you will be free. Fail, and you will remain here forever." I nodded, steeling myself for whatever lay ahead. "I'm ready." The first challenge began immediately. The floor of the chamber shifted, revealing a series of platforms suspended over a bottomless pit. The platforms were arranged in a complex pattern, and I could see that some of them were unstable, teetering precariously. "Cross the pit," the Guardian instructed. "But beware, not all platforms are safe." I took a deep breath and stepped onto the first platform. It wobbled slightly but held my weight. Carefully, I made my way from one platform to the next, testing each one before committing my full weight. The unstable platforms were easy to spot, as they swayed dangerously when I touched them. Halfway across, I encountered a platform that seemed stable but gave way as soon as I stepped on it. I managed to grab the edge of the next platform just in time, pulling myself up and narrowly avoiding a fall into the abyss below. My heart raced, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I continued, my movements more cautious now. Each step felt like a gamble, but I slowly made my way to the other side. When I finally reached solid ground, I looked back at the pit, a sense of accomplishment washing over me. "Well done," the Guardian said, though his tone was devoid of genuine praise. But that was only the beginning. The chamber shifted again, and the second challenge materialized. This time, I found myself in a labyrinth of mirrors, similar to the corridor I had navigated earlier. The reflections were distorted, and the whispers returned, louder and more disorienting. "Find the exit," the Guardian's voice echoed. "But beware, the mirrors can deceive." I moved cautiously through the labyrinth, the whispers growing louder with each step. The reflections twisted and warped, showing me versions of myself that were monstrous and grotesque. It was as if the mirrors were reflecting my deepest fears and insecurities. I tried to ignore the reflections and focus on finding the exit. The labyrinth seemed to twist and turn endlessly, each corridor looking the same as the last. The whispers became more insistent, and I struggled to keep my bearings. At one point, I encountered a mirror that showed a perfect reflection of myself. It seemed out of place among the distorted images. I hesitated, then reached out to touch the glass. Instead of feeling a solid surface, my hand passed through the mirror, revealing a hidden passage. I stepped through the mirror and found myself in a small room with a single door. The whispers faded, and I felt a sense of relief. I opened the door and stepped back into the main chamber, where the Guardian awaited. "You are more resourceful than I anticipated," he said, "but there is one final challenge." The chamber transformed once more, and I found myself standing in a field of tall grass, the sky above me dark and stormy. In the distance, I could see a figure moving through the grass. It was another player, like me, trapped in this game. "Only one of you can leave," the Guardian's voice boomed. "Defeat your opponent and you will be free." My heart sank. I didn't want to fight another person, but I knew I had no choice. The figure in the distance turned to face me, and I could see the fear and determination in their eyes. They were just as desperate to escape as I was. We circled each other, the tension thick in the air. I tried to think of a way to incapacitate them without causing serious harm, but they lunged at me before I could come up with a plan. We struggled in the grass, both of us fighting with everything we had. It was a brutal, desperate fight. I could feel my strength waning, but I couldn't give up. I had to escape this nightmare. Finally, I managed to pin my opponent down, and they stopped struggling, their breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please," they whispered, "just end it." I hesitated, my hands trembling. I didn't want to do this, but I knew I had no choice. With a heavy heart, I delivered the final blow, and my opponent went limp. I stood up, my body shaking with exhaustion and grief. The field dissolved around me, and I found myself back in the chamber with the Guardian. He looked at me with a mixture of respect and something else, perhaps a hint of sorrow. "You have proven yourself worthy," he said. "You are free to go." A portal opened behind me, shimmering with a strange light. I took one last look at the Guardian, then stepped through the portal, hoping it would lead me back to the real world. I awoke in my room, the VR headset still on my head. I ripped it off and looked around, my heart racing. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had experienced was more than just a game. As I sat there, trying to process everything, I noticed a message on my computer screen. It was from the game company, congratulating me on completing the beta test and thanking me for my participation. There was no mention of the horrors I had faced, no acknowledgement of the other players trapped in the game. I closed the message and shut down my computer, my mind racing with questions. Was it really just a game? Or had I been trapped in some twisted experiment? I may never know the truth, but one thing is certain. I will never look at virtual reality the same way again. The days following my escape from Immersia were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the twisted corridors, the distorted mirrors, and the haunting eyes of the Guardian. It was as if the game had left an indelible mark on my psyche. I tried to return to my normal routine, but everything felt off. I avoided using my computer, the VR headset tucked away in a closet where I hoped it would remain forgotten. My friends noticed the change in me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened. How could I explain the horrors of Immersia without sounding insane? One evening, as I was attempting to distract myself with a book, my phone buzzed. It was an email from an unknown sender. The subject line simply read, "We need to talk." My heart raced as I opened the message. From The Guardian. Subject, "We need to talk." Message, "You think you escaped, but the game isn't over. Meet me where it all began." My blood ran cold. How could this be happening? The Guardian was just a character in the game, right? But the email felt too real, too personal. I knew I had to find out the truth, even if it meant facing my fears once more. Reluctantly, I retrieved the VR headset and put it on. The familiar darkness enveloped me, and I braced myself for what was to come. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the small, dimly lit room with the pulsing symbols on the walls. The sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. "Welcome back," the Guardian's voice echoed through the room. "I knew you couldn't stay away." I turned to face him, my anger and fear bubbling to the surface. "What do you want from me?" I demanded. "Why are you doing this?" The Guardian stepped closer, his eyes glowing with that same eerie light. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't just a game. It's a test, a way to push the boundaries of human consciousness. You were chosen because of your potential." "Potential for what?" I shouted, my frustration boiling over. "For greatness," he replied, his tone calm and measured. "But also for darkness. The game reveals the true nature of those who play it. And you, my friend, have shown both remarkable resilience and a willingness to do whatever it takes to survive." I felt a chill run down my spine. The memory of the final challenge, of defeating the other player, was still fresh in my mind. I had done what I had to do, but it haunted me. "So what now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Is this some kind of sick experiment?" The Guardian nodded. "In a way, yes. But it's also an opportunity. You have the chance to join us, to become part of something greater. Or you can walk away and live the rest of your life with the knowledge that there is more to this world than you ever imagined." I stared at him, trying to process his words. Part of me wanted to run, to escape this nightmare once and for all, but another part was intrigued, curious about what lay beyond the game. The Guardian extended his hand, offering me a choice. "Join us," he said, "and unlock your true potential, or walk away and never look back." I hesitated, my mind racing with possibilities. What did it mean to join them? Would I be trapped in the game forever, or was there something more? The uncertainty was maddening, but I knew I couldn't ignore the opportunity to learn the truth. With a deep breath, I reached out and took the Guardian's hand. The moment our hands touched, the room dissolved around us, and I was plunged into darkness once more. When the darkness lifted, I found myself in a vast open space, surrounded by other players. Some looked as bewildered as I felt, while others seemed more confident, as if they had been here before. "Welcome to the inner circle," the Guardian announced, his voice resonating through the space. "You have been chosen to join us in exploring the limits of human potential. Here, you will face new challenges, uncover hidden truths, and push the boundaries of what it means to be human." I looked around, trying to take it all in. The other players were a mix of ages and backgrounds, each one seemingly chosen for their unique abilities. I felt a sense of camaraderie, but also a lingering fear. What had I gotten myself into? As the Guardian continued to speak, explaining the rules and expectations of the inner circle, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made the right choice. The challenges ahead were sure to be even more difficult and disturbing than what I had already faced. But I also felt a strange sense of purpose, a desire to see how far I could go. The Guardian finished his speech, and we were given time to explore our new surroundings. The space was vast and ever-changing, with new areas appearing and disappearing at random. It was a place of endless possibility, but also endless danger. As I wandered through the ever-shifting landscape, I thought about the other player I had defeated in the game. Had they been given the same choice? And if so, had they made the same decision as me? The thought weighed heavily on my mind, but I pushed it aside. I had to focus on the challenges ahead. In the days that followed, I faced trials that tested my physical, mental, and emotional limits. The Guardian was always watching, guiding us through each challenge with a mix of encouragement and intimidation. Some players thrived, while others struggled, but we all learned and grew in ways we never could have imagined. One night, as I lay in my bed, I received another message from the Guardian. It was short and to the point. "The final challenge awaits. Be prepared." I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The final challenge. What would it entail? And was I truly ready for it? There was only one way to find out. The next day, I joined the other players in the central chamber, where the Guardian awaited us. He explained that the final challenge would be the ultimate test of our abilities, and that only those who succeeded would be granted the full power and knowledge of the inner circle. As the challenge began, I steeled myself for whatever lay ahead. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to see it through to the end. This was my chance to prove myself, to unlock my true potential and discover the secrets of the inner circle. With a deep breath, I stepped forward, ready to face the final challenge and uncover the truth behind the game. The final challenge loomed before us, an ominous presence that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The other players and I stood in the central chamber, facing the Guardian, whose eyes glowed with a mixture of anticipation and menace. "Welcome to the final challenge," he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. "This will be the ultimate test of your abilities, your resilience, and your will to survive. Only those who succeed will be granted the full power and knowledge of the inner circle." I exchanged nervous glances with the other players. We had all been through so much, and now it came down to this. Whatever the final challenge was, I knew it would push us to our limits. The Guardian raised his hand, and the chamber began to shift and change. The floor beneath us gave way, and we were plunged into darkness. When the darkness lifted, we found ourselves in a vast, desolate landscape. The sky was a sickly shade of grey, and the air was filled with the smell of decay. "You must navigate this wasteland," the Guardian's voice echoed in our minds. "Find the source of the corruption and destroy it. Only then will you be free." The landscape was treacherous, filled with crumbling ruins and twisted, gnarled trees. The ground was uneven, and every step felt like a struggle. As we moved forward, we encountered creatures that seemed to be born from nightmares. Grotesque, misshapen beings that attacked without warning. I fought alongside the other players, using every ounce of strength and skill I had developed during my time in the inner circle. The battles were brutal, and more than once I thought I wouldn't make it. But we pressed on, driven by the hope of freedom and the promise of knowledge. As we ventured deeper into the wasteland, the corruption grew more intense. The ground oozed with a thick, black substance that seemed to have a life of its own. It clung to our shoes, slowing our progress and sapping our strength. The creatures grew more numerous and more aggressive, as if sensing our determination. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the heart of the corruption. It was a massive, pulsating mass of darkness, surrounded by a swarm of nightmarish creatures. The source of the corruption seemed to radiate pure malevolence, and I could feel its presence pressing down on my mind. The Guardian's voice echoed in our minds once more. "Destroy the source, and you will be free." We attacked the mass of darkness with everything we had, but it was unlike anything we had faced before. It seemed impervious to our attacks, and the creatures defending it fought with a ferocity that left us battered and exhausted. I watched as the other players fell one by one, overwhelmed by the relentless assault. Despair threatened to overtake me, but I couldn't give up. I had come too far, endured too much. I had to see this through to the end. With a surge of determination, I launched myself at the heart of the corruption, plunging my weapon into its dark, pulsating core. The mass of darkness shuddered and let out a deafening roar. The ground beneath me trembled, and I felt a surge of energy course through my body. The mass of darkness began to dissolve, and the creatures surrounding it let out anguished cries as they too disintegrated. The corruption was receding, and the landscape around us began to heal. The sky cleared, and a warm, golden light bathed the wasteland. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted but victorious. The other players who had survived gathered around me, their faces a mix of relief and disbelief. We had done it. We had defeated the corruption and completed the final challenge. The Guardian appeared before us, his eyes no longer menacing, but filled with a strange, almost paternal pride. "You have succeeded," he said, his voice softer now. "You have proven your worth and unlocked your true potential. Welcome to the inner circle." With a wave of his hand, the landscape around us dissolved, and we were back in the central chamber. The Guardian looked at each of us in turn, his expression one of approval. "You are now part of something greater," he said. "You have unlocked the secrets of the game and proven yourselves worthy. The knowledge and power of the inner circle are yours to wield. Use them wisely. As the Guardian spoke, I felt a surge of energy and understanding course through me. It was as if a veil had been lifted and I could see the world in a new light. The challenges I had faced, the horrors I had endured, they had all been part of a greater purpose. I looked at the other players, my comrades in this strange journey. We had been through hell and back, but we had emerged stronger, more resilient. We were no longer just players in a game. We were members of the inner circle, bearers of a knowledge and power that transcended the boundaries of reality. As I removed the VR headset and returned to the real world, I knew that my life would never be the same. The game had changed me, revealed parts of myself I never knew existed, and though the journey had been harrowing, I felt a sense of purpose and clarity that I had never experienced before. The Guardian's final words echoed in my mind. Use them wisely. I knew that the knowledge and power of the inner circle came with great responsibility, but I was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the strength and resilience I had gained from my journey through Immersia. And as I looked out at the world around me, I knew that I would never be the same again.